November the 22nd. I'm going to talk on Madagascar and perhaps a little on the West Indian Ocean. Madagascar. The outline of the talk, Earth's plates and their interaction. I'm going back to basics here. We'll move on then to the supercontinent, or half the supercontinent of Pangaea, which is our well-known Gondwana, when all the southern continents were together. And we'll talk about Madagascar as a component of that, its separation from Africa, and a little bit on the geology of the island, and then its subsequent separation from India, and the bits that broke off, which are the Seychelles Islands. And there was a huge event about this time, 66 million years ago, which is registered by an enormous amount of volcanics in India. Then a little bit on the animal life, Madagascar as an ark, or was it actually an ark? And finally, the fact that volcanism continues on Madagascar today. Briefly, the crust of the Earth is thin and brittle and broken into plates, like the cracked eggshell of a hard-boiled egg. The core of the Earth is like the yolk, except it's solid in the centre, surrounded by molten nickel iron. The mantle could be compared to lightly parboiled egg white, and it would probably be like the oil of the lava lamp that I show on the left. It's, however, 3,000 kilometres thick. Convection currents rise slowly with the heat, fueled by the hot core with molten nickel iron, several thousand degrees probably. When they reach the surface, the convection currents spread laterally under the 100-kilometre thick plates, and these tend to separate continuously on the margin, on their margins, on the plate margins, forming new volcanic ocean crust. But the Earth doesn't expand because, in fact, some places where plates meet, one subducts or slips in underneath another, and that retains the actual diameter of the Earth. Occasionally, you actually get these hot spots, are particularly noticeable in the middle of oceans, where heat rising as bubbles or plumes from the core create enormous volcanic areas. One of those is Iceland. Another one, strangely enough, is the region between Melbourne and Mount Gambier, where there are 400 or so volcanic centres over the last few million years. So that underneath us somewhere there's a plume coming off from the outer core of the Earth. Moving on, of course, we know there's a difference between continents, which are effectively the scum, you might say, and ocean crust, which is relatively thin, only about 8 kilometres, and comprised of volcanic rock of basaltic composition, as distinct from the continental crust. It's got a lot of granites and sediments and lighter rocks in general, and these tend to float on the underlying Earth mantle. But of course, part of the mantle is included in the plates, the more rocky part of it, down to about 100 kilometres. And it's there that the movement of the plates is generated by convection currents. I read here at the bottom, at divergent plate boundaries in oceanic crust, continual volcanism leads to new ocean crust. Therefore, oceans in general are expanding. Portions of them do disappear in subduction zones. To this slide, the Australian plate, we tend to think of Australia as a continent floating on its own, but it's actually just sitting on, passively, on the large plate shown here in pink, and it's almost contiguous with the Indian plate, or has been for the last 20 million years or so. We seem to be separating now across the middle of the Indian Ocean, where it reads 90 East Sumatra orogeny, and that just means there's activity going on at the moment, even subsea mountain building. But the north part of the Australian plate is very complex with all these blue lines. That is subduction going on, where the oceanic portion of the plate is sliding in under Asia, or the Eurasian plate, the Pacific plate in the east. I won't go into the complexities of that. But in the east, That's also subduction going on, but it's actually the Pacific oceanic crust which is sliding in under the Australian plate. That's happening in the North Island of New Zealand, but not really in the South Island of New Zealand, where there's a little green line running through that, which is just a slipping boundary, where the Australian plate is slipping to the north against the Pacific plate. No expansion to speak of or subduction is taking place there. All along the southern boundary with the Antarctic plate and around to where we read Somali plate in the far left top corner and the Indian plate, it's largely an expanding ocean spreading centre, which means there's upwelling convection currents there, continuously bringing basaltic magma to the surface and enlarging that portion of the plate, and hence enlarging the Indian Ocean at the expense of subduction elsewhere. Oceans disappear in some areas across our north, but they're enlarging really along the west and southern boundaries. Three types of plate boundary. There's the divergent plate boundary or spreading one, which is illustrated here. Classically, what you see in Africa starting to form in the middle of a continent, but this is actually going on in the centre of all oceans, really, and is the reason oceans are spreading or enlarging, so that you've got the convection currents or the cells rising from below, spreading laterally and drawing the plates apart, so that you often get a doming with high shoulders and a central wedge, like a keystone wedge on an arch, which drops down as the expansion occurs. And the red matter is magma or liquid rock that's formed about 100 kilometres down and is continuously intruding along a ridge in the central oceans. Hence, you get gradual expansion of both plates and their movement apart. And that's what breaks up a supercontinent. That's the top type of boundary. The middle type of boundary we've discussed a lot previously, and that's where there's compression or convergence. And with oceanic plates, one will slide down into the mantle and go thousands of kilometres down, gradually being incorporated into the mush, I suppose it is, of the mantle. The third type is, in those three on the right, is the transform fault, the typical one being the San Andreas fault, or if you wish, the alpine fault of the South Island of New Zealand, where the plates are just actively sliding past one another and not sliding down or crushing up. Reading that under the diagram, there are three types of plate boundary, two of which, divergent and transform, are apparent with the Somali plate, which we're going to talk about today, of the Western Indian Ocean. There's no convergent plate boundary involved with the Somali plate. Hence, there's no subduction anywhere around it. Here's a picture again, a portion of the Australian plate. Australian continent's fairly obvious, and then there are colours of green and grey and a lighter green and browns, etc., which indicate the older portions of ocean that represent the separation of India from Australia. And over in the east, there's a similar green and brown zone, which is the Tasman Ocean, representing the separation of New Zealand from mainland Australia, or the continent of Zealandia, which is mostly subsea, some 80 million years ago. Antarctica, or what is effectively Antarctica, is the darker brown in the bottom left corner. And the Antarctic plate extends all the way across to the red line in the centre of the Southern Ocean, where it meets with the Australian plate. And that is where expansion of ocean floor is going on all the time along that mid-ocean ridge, the red line. So if you look at the pink, they'd be rocks formed by the current spreading, probably the last 5 million years or so. The lightest of the yellows might be 20 to 30 million or 10 to 30 million. The next darker yellow, 30 to 50. Then finally you get an orange and a green or brown and green, which are 50 to 60 million years old. And they're quite symmetrical, effectively, about that central ridge, representing the age of formation of the rocks successively as the spreading occurs in mid-ocean. Going on today, of course, that's where most of the world's volcanoes would be erupting. We don't see them very often, except perhaps for the beauty in the Pacific earlier this year. Looking now at the general diagram of Earth's plates, it's a bit confusing there, but perhaps if you look at the Australian plate, you can see the continent of Australia surrounded by growing ocean, all of which is less than 150 million years old. So there's no older ocean crust known anywhere, except perhaps in mountain ranges and things where it's been crushed together at plate boundaries. One way or another, ocean crust seems to subduct before it gets to be older than about 200 million years, 150 to 200 million years. Continents, however, survive much longer, although they tend to crack up and move apart, as we're going to discuss in the case of Gondwana, when South American, Antarctic, African, Indian, Australian plates and the Somali plate were all crushed together in the supercontinent, or the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. Arabia was part of that too, a couple of 100 million years ago. You'll notice we've got the Somali plate there representing the Horn of Africa, Zambia, Kenya, and hence it's been given the name Somali plate, and it includes the grey area, which has been a plate in the past, is strictly not one now, and that includes Madagascar, as is shown in slightly darker grey. So just reading that, the Somali plate has broken away on a divergent boundary from the African/Nubian plate. So the African plate today we generally think of as everything going from mid-Atlantic Ocean, including the mass of Africa, and including the Somali plate, which is really, I suppose, in the process of breaking away from the western portion, which is known as the Nubian section of the African plate. So here we look in more detail at that section of East Africa. You'll notice there the African plate name on the left-hand side of the enlarged diagram is called Nubian in brackets. And then down lower right at about 4 o'clock, we've got African plate Somalian or Somali plate. This zone of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the East African Rift, shown by all the dashed lines, is the creation of new oceans, which ultimately would result in the separation of Arabia and the Somali plate from the main Nubian mass of Africa. There's always resistance to the movements of plates, and of course the Arabian plate has probably taken 60 million years to open the Red Sea as wide as it is. The red triangles, incidentally, are all volcanoes on land, on the shoulders of the rifts, and right in the valleys that are formed by subsidence along the central rift zones. You notice how complex the area is around Lake Victoria, which is really a huge area of upwelling or swelling, you might say, and Lake Victoria represents that keystone wedge that's dropped in the centre of a very big dome. Well, here, just a topographic map of the central portion of Africa, Nubian part of Africa. The Somali plate includes Tanzania, Uganda, and Lake Victoria, which is this central grey lake in the middle of all that uplifted dome. It gives you an idea of what these rifts are like on a continent, which may ultimately be the central zone of an ocean with parallel bands of basaltic ocean crust. And the reading underneath, East African Rift. The molten mantle rocks cause upwelling centres of heat the domed sections of the surface on a very large scale. The Lake Victoria region of Uganda has dropped like a keystone on the crown of this dome. Now this, you can make out Africa and perhaps Lake Victoria there with that rift with a whole series of lakes in it to the west of it, right at the 9 o'clock position. You can see the Red Sea in the north and the Gulf of Aden, which in this case is coloured red. But that red zone running through the whole diagram like a fracture is indeed a fracture. The plate boundary between the Indian plate or the Indian Australian plates and the Somali plate. And the red are the relatively recent volcanic rocks that have been formed by expansion of the ocean up to 20 million years ago. The yellows range in age from 20 to 80 million years ago, where they're being dusted by green. And older oceanic crust of 120 million years age lies between Madagascar and mainland Africa. That tells us that Madagascar somehow originated from Africa. Actually, we can work out that it was stuck right up near the Horn of Africa initially, that it didn't just move laterally, it actually slid southward quite a long way, and we'll discover that India slid with it in those days. And then India separated and went north subsequently. So this is the bathymetry, or the topography, you might say, undersea of the West Indian Ocean, WIO, showing the spreading ridge to the east, the art of the Mascarene Plateau, which is central, starting at where the 40 million years is right in the centre of the diagram. Deep basins to the north and centre and south of Madagascar in the blue colours. These are probably more subtle to you, but there's a basinal area north of the 120 million years, just shown at the north end of Madagascar, which is presumably a basin that started sinking about 120 million years ago when that ocean crust was first formed. And there's also one more or less underneath it, underneath the 120 million year figure there at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. That's just west of the main mass of Madagascar, tucked in under the bump of Africa. Then there's another basin to the southwest of Madagascar with a ridge running due south from Madagascar. And these are all good petroleum prospects today. Islands and ridges in the Mozambique Channel between Madagascar and the mainland also show up. And there's a shallow plateau, as I've mentioned, to the south of Madagascar. Now, this Mascarene Plateau, where 40 million years is marked dead centre in the diagram, that's the Seychelles Islands. You'll notice there's a prominent ridge running southward from that down to towards 6 o'clock. We'll be discussing that ridge, which is quite separate from the island region of the Seychelles, which is actually a piece of continent, and we can describe why it is. And it's related to India, and you see the west coast of India is coloured in the same sort of grey. But from that top section of India, right up at 2 o'clock on the margin of the diagram, you have another very prominent ridge running right down along the line of longitude towards the central ridge of the ocean. So we'll discuss those two ridges, which have an origin related to one another. Now, we have a whole series of old boundaries and newly forming boundaries, describing a Madagascar platelet and a Somali plate. In fact, plates keep changing, and it's not just a static phenomenon to talk of the Australian plate, for example, because we are currently apparently separating from the Indian plate. And the big tsunami that we had back in 2004 was right on that incipient boundary between the Australian and Indian plates, just proving how unsettled our Earth can be. I don't need to go into any detail on these, but it's really just showing us that nothing is fixed in life. These things keep changing. Now, a little bit briefly on the geology of Madagascar. I'll go into a bit more detail later on. I haven't shown any of the geology of Africa here, but there are older rocks in the east, or the main portion of Madagascar, and along the eastern coast. Many of these are older than, well, even older than 2 billion years, certainly exceeded 1 billion years, whereas the west coast are younger sediments and rocks that are related to the formation of the Mozambique Channel, or the two basins to the north and south of that, the Madagascar Basin, for example, or the Tanzanian Basin to the north. I beg your pardon, it's Somali Basin to the north, isn't it? So those green, blue and pinkish rocks along the western margin, well, they would be more familiar to people of New South Wales, where the rocks are younger than the, say, the Flinders Ranges. There aren't any rocks as old as that involved in this belt. So sedimentary rocks of the west include sandstones, unconsolidated sands, and a couple of limestones of different ages. It might be 400 million years, 300 million years. And one produces a very spectacular style of outcrop, which we're not very familiar with in Australia, although we have some around the southeast and Mount Gambier, and that's karstic weathering with jagged, highly eroded limestone pinnacles. And they're all less than 500 million years. Large areas of the central and eastern region of the island are older metamorphic rocks. That means they've been changed by heat and folding and faulting and crushing. And they include granites and gneissic rocks, which are described as bigmatites. They've been sheared by multiple phases of mountain building. And they include sandstones that have been altered to quartzite, marbles, which were originally limestones and have been heated to form crystalline marble, and rocks, ultra basics, that were actually originally oceanic rocks that have been incorporated in ages-old mountain building. These are often covered by thick layers of laterite on the plateau, and this is an iron-rich weathering product, or almost a soil product, which, of course, we mine have mined at Gove and areas like Weipa, where it's been subjected to tropical weathering, alternate humidity, rain situations. But there are also young lavas and basalts resulting from a hotspot in local areas, and they're rather like we see in the Mount Gambier and western districts of Victoria. Just a brief comment on the geological history. Madagascar was probably part of the broader Nubian-Arabian shield, but was up north of Tanzania a billion years ago or more. Although Africa actually didn't come together until about 600 million years ago, unlike Australia, which probably came together as a unit 3 times older than that. 1,500, 1,800 million years ago, Africa really only welded up with its various blocks about 600 million years ago, about the time we were rejoicing in wonderful beaches along our east coast, extending from Adelaide to the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Flinders Ranges, McDonnell Ranges being representatives of that time. Madagascar was part of a mini continent called Azania about 800 million years ago, when it was effectively still attached, or certainly part of Tanzania, or East Africa as it was forming. And there was a Mozambique Ocean, which extended really from ancient Antarctica through the zone of Madagascar to cross the Horn of Africa, and included Arabia and portions of India, etc., I believe. With closure of the Mozambique Ocean, you had Africa coming together about 600 million years ago, and Madagascar was then welded to India and to Tanzania and to Somalia, or about their junction to the north of its present position. But because that was a mountain range with closure going on over thousands of kilometres, extending essentially from Antarctica through into Turkey, as we know them today, you had compression with thrusts in the older basement rocks of the order of 620 million years. There was actually thrusting in both directions, but in Madagascar it's obvious in an eastward direction. And this is overprinted by more crushing about 550 million years, and still compression and shortening occurred for another 50 million years after that. So it was a great mountain range extending along what is essentially the east coast of Africa today. And that probably had effect for several hundred million years, spreading sediment laterally across Africa and across the Australian continent, subsequently in the period of Gondwana as recently as 200 million years ago. Looking at that eastern section of Africa, we've got a lot of red belts there, pink belts, etc. And those are ancient rocks. Essentially, most are older than 2 or 2.5 billion years. And they're called cratons. I won't try and differentiate the margins of the various bits that came together about 600 million years ago, but they've got monikers on them, CT, B, ZKC, etc. They're listed in that description, so that they are separate blocks floating around. Some of them may have been tens of thousands or thousands of kilometres away, but about 600 million years ago, they decided to aggregate the scum monopoda jam and form one mass or one continent, and that is the continent of Africa, only 600 million years old. You can also see an outline in a bluish dashed line of Azania, what is considered to have been a separate continent floating around that was welded into this mass, and Madagascar actually was a portion of that. So that was in existence until it was welded into this mountain range 600 million years ago. Recorded at the very bottom, the red and pink colours are crustal blocks older than 1 billion years, whereas that pale green in the north is young oceanic crust, almost forming today. It confuses matters a little bit because all that is opening in the middle of what was the original Azania continent 600 to 800 million years ago, until it welded into the mass of Africa and India. I won't read all the detail of that slide. I will say that within the junctions along the Azania borders, there are many indications of the mountain building or orogenesis, that Mozambique orogenic belt, which lasted from 700 to 530 million years ago, was crushed and welded with blocks of material from ocean crust and much changed or metamorphosed complexes which may have originally been volcanic arcs and similar phenomena formed by subduction in those years. When did Africa come together again? Well, there's a so-called Pan-African orogeny or Pan-African period of mountain building about 600 million years ago. And that's when the Mozambique Ocean was closing. And that was between effectively Madagascar, India, and the various cratons of Africa. It started about 700 million years ago and took several hundred million years of mountain building to quieten down. When it quietened down, it was probably one of the most prominent mountain belts of Earth, a bit like Alps today. This is called the Mozambique tectonic belt, tectonic meaning much mountain building activity or plate activity, plate interaction. It extended from East Antarctica through East Africa up to the Arabian Nubian Shield areas, and it formed as a suture between plates during this Pan-African orogeny that lasted 200 million years, focused on about 600 million years ago. Probably this is drawn for the closure of the entire mountain range about 500 million years ago, when Gondwana had come together. You can see that we've got the east coast of North America in yellow. You could step off from New York into Chile, and the Kalahari Craton, you could step off into Antarctica, and likewise India, Madagascar were all joined there under the Horn of Africa. Well, the Asian fragments were scattered all over the place in some area to the north of Australia, many of which have been actually derived from that eastern section of Gondwana in subsequent times, split off from Western Australia, a greater portion of India, which is not really shown there, and North Arabia. They separated with a whole series of oceans and have been crushed back again as alpine mountains, the Zagros through Iran, Iraq, Himalayas extending around into Burma, and of course the folding of the Indonesian and New Guinean mountains of today. But of course, when you consider this mountain belt, it had two margins marked 1 and 2 there, and those are the closed borders, you might say, of this zone that underwent enormous crushing for a couple of 100 million years. So it resulted in a dominant mountain range about 500 million or 500 million years ago. We're saying then, in this period, the Mozambique orogenic belt had many subduction zones, so it was very complicated. Oceans closed in there. We don't know much about them, but the subduction zones are recorded from the rock types we see, and they're also different, very different volcanic rocks, which indicate there were island arcs in oceanic settings, and metamorphosed complexes or changed masses of rock that have been much heated and deep in the crust, and have subsequently been thrust up from depths of 15, 20 kilometres perhaps, and are now overlying younger rocks even in some cases. Again, just a little more on the closing of that Mozambique spelt there. Ocean closed as India converged on the cratons of Africa, the Kalahari, the Congo, and the Sahara cratons. They're those older masses, 2 billion-year-old rocks, we might say. And it resulted in the East African orogeny, which is usually given a date about 600 million years. And it was a mountain belt which dominated the globe probably 500 or 520 million years ago. Within it was a microcontinent of probably greater than a billion-year-old crust, Azania, which we mentioned previously, and remnants of this occur in southern India, central Madagascar, Somalia, eastern Ethiopia, Arabia, Yemen, etc., etc. So we have some indication of a former continent that's been incorporated in that very altered, very structurally complex region. So this is the area we're focusing on, Madagascar, and look, in Gondwana, it was sitting well up to the north against Tanzania and against the western sector of India. Just comment here that there seems to be a cycle of about 600 million years in which continents come together, and then they must heat up by the blanketing effect of this light scum, or the rock types of low melting point. Better phrase would be the slag. Actually, if you're dealing with a melt of iron ore, you have a slag, and this is the composition of slag, effectively. And every 600 million years or so, these masses or aggregated masses of continents tend to break up, spread around the globe, and then come back again some 600 million years later. So there are about 4 cycles known over the past 2.5 billion years of this formation of supercontinents. And of course, mountain ranges develop where these major continents collide. And plates keep changing as a result as the oceans expand and subduct in various areas. Coming forward to the breakup of Gondwana, so that previous diagram was about 200 million years ago. Now, at about 120 million years ago, we see the oceanic crust to the west of Madagascar. And so that's when it's separated from Africa. And this is Madagascar block is comprised of rocks of this ancient Nubian Arabian shield or of the subcontinent Azania that existed at that time. Well, after Madagascar separated from Africa, it was still moving with India, and India rifted away from it 80 million years ago. But dispersed fragments of rocks that had come from really the joining up of Africa about 600 million years ago were left behind as the Seychelles group, which is in effect a mini continent. And we'll look into that in a short time. A large igneous province existed under India. That is to say, one of these hotspots, 66 million years ago, left an enormous amount of volcanic rocks in India known as the Deccan Traps. And subsequently, as the plates have moved across that hotspot, which has remained consistent for hundreds of millions of years, very probably, you've had extinct seamounts present as the Maldives and Mauritius, etc., in 2 lines of suboceanic seamounts. So the plates have moved across the hotspot, leaving a trail of extinct volcanoes, and there is a current hotspot from which all that arose, including the Deccan Traps in India, and that is down currently, or has always been, at the one spot to the east of Madagascar, so that India was down there 66 million years ago. And that huge phase of volcanism, combination of subsea and on the continental mass of India, may have been part of the cause of the mass extinction event that killed off a very large proportion of terrestrial and marine life. It more or less coincided with a huge impact of a body from outer space in the region of Yucatan Peninsula, Mexico. 10-kilometre body hitting Earth, of course, had enormous effect on climate and no doubt accounted for much of the extinction events, which may not have all been at the same geological instant. 120 million years ago, the Somali Basin had opened, and that's to the north of Madagascar. And Madagascar slid southward, you might say. Well, it's shown here sliding relative to India, but also there was a plate boundary on its western side, and it slid southward relative to Africa. But we're showing it 100 million years starting to slide away from India, where it was really 150 to 120 million years ago that it separated from East Africa. And its final separation from India didn't occur till 85 million years ago, and India itself started its rapid northward drift. Now, all these 2 diagrams are perhaps a bit hard to understand. But if you look at 100 million years ago, India, Madagascar is still essentially in same or in close relative position, but they have opened up the Somali Basin. So there's been up to 50 million years of sliding away from Africa, but now it's that faulting system has moved to the east of Madagascar, and it's just starting to separate. Certainly at 66 million years, you can see the Seychelles sitting quite close to the centre of this Indian volcanism, which was enormous in scale, and that's represented by the red circle, so that you do get rocks within the Seychelles that are 66 million years old, intruding rocks of about 600 million years old, which is really the age of welding of the original blocks into the mountain range we talked about earlier. If you look at the right-hand diagram B, you notice a red spot with a tiny red arrow from the 66 million years. That's roughly where the reunion hotspot is today and where it has always remained. And in fact, I'm assuming there that Madagascar, relatively close to its present position, although the ocean has expanded subsequently. And in fact, so much so that the plate boundary has moved to the other side of that red spot after 66 million years and expanded to separate India northward. So it's all a bit complicated, takes some thought to get it straight in the brain, I guess. I'll read this underneath. 120 million years ago, the Somali Basin had opened and Madagascar had moved southward. 85 million years ago, India separated from Madagascar, and that's the fault we see sliding on the east side of Madagascar, and began rapid northward drift. And at 66 million years, India was over the reunion hotspot. So the whole of this diagram was almost its full width further to the south. Red spot at 66 million years on their right-hand diagram has remained a constant point. India has started to move northward and leave a trail of extinct volcanoes, including, of course, the Deccan Trap mass in India. Looking at the Deccan Traps, here we see this in black, the volcanics related to that hotspot activity 66, 65 million years ago, and a huge crater, the Shiva crater, and the position that they consider the Deccan reunion hotspot lay at that time, 65 million years ago. So there's an enormous mass of basic volcanics there, which have come from deep in the crust, the heat having come up on a, you might say, a plume from the outer core, some 3,000 kilometres down. Reunion Island today, which of course is a long way away from this spot, is attributed to a mantle hotspot, which always remained in the same position and which first created the Deccan Traps, which means India was down south over it at that time. And these are a large basalt province in India, intruded or extruded as volcanism about 65 million years ago. And the trace of this zone of volcanism extends to Mauritius, which was created about 18 or 28 million years ago, whereas Reunion further south became active about 5 million years ago and only reached the surface of the ocean 2 million years ago. It's the youngest island originating from this hotspot. It's the only one still active, of course. There's a whole train of the extinct volcanoes representing the movement of the plate northward, which go right up to the Deccan Traps. And here's a photo in India of the Deccan Trap volcanics, an enormous mass of basaltic extrusive rocks, or volcanic rocks. Now, It's not always easy to work out the movement of oceans, the expansion of oceans and so on, but it is a whole field of expertise. And I'll just show you this next picture, which indicates some of the growth lines in the oceans, in the Indian Ocean. Enormously complex to our eyes, but from rocks of a given age and the magnetic patterns in them, experts are able to work out exactly how that movement took place. We won't unravel it and all its complications in this discussion, of course, but that would be the opening of the Indian Ocean, which in fact resulted in the closure of all those grey areas, which were the Tethyan oceans. 3 successive oceans up there were closed as the Indian Ocean opened and enlarged. Very complicated story. Looking at it in what I'd call a simple fashion, we're now moving on from the 66 million years to 45 million years ago in that diagram C on the left-hand side. And the double lines, black lines, where the ocean is expanding. And in fact, at this point in time, 45 million years ago, that plate boundary, which is the, you might say, the central spreading ridge of the Indian Ocean, has crossed over. So that instead of being on the north side, as was in the previous diagram of the ocean spreading centre, both it and the Seychelles are on the south side. They're now on the Somali plate, effectively, rather than being on the Indian plate. That means that the plates and plate boundaries even can move together across a fixed point. And that fixed point today is way down south at the 6 o'clock position due east of Madagascar. So there's been that amount of movement subsequently. Okay, if we look at today, okay, we see the hotspot down east of Madagascar, but there's a break in the line of extinct volcanoes. If you run back to the north through Mauritius, you then have to jump eastward in a break before you can continue up to the Maldives and to the Deccan Traps in India. Why is this so? Well, because when the plates crossed, it meant that any subsequent spreading just separated the old subsea mountain ridges, the extinct volcanic trend. So hopefully we can understand that. It means that you don't just get a simple line of extinct volcanoes. It is broken by the newer growth since 45 million years of the Indian Ocean. So reading that underneath, more than 60 million years ago, the Seychelles rifted away from India and the mid-ocean ridge crossed over them, crossed over the reunion hotspot is really what I'm trying to say, from southwest to northeast about 47 million years ago. So those plates crossed over the hotspot. And of course, that occurred down in that southern red spot, but everything's moved northward since. Mid-ocean spread has since separated the trend of extinct volcanoes related to this reunion hotspot, which has remained stationary, and that's as shown in the right-hand side of the diagram. The reunion today is a very impressive hotspot. Here are 3 of the volcanoes. It's a sort of Iceland in the middle of the Indian Ocean in a way. It's very much that, a hotspot. But in fact, in the case of Iceland, it's right on the plate boundary where this has been crossed by the plate boundary, which is a bit different. If we move on from a discussion of the reunion hotspot to a look at life on Madagascar, when we look at it back 120 million years in the age of dinosaurs, the Indian subcontinent and Madagascar were together and they became isolated at about 120 million years ago, so that they have a fairly distinctive dinosaur fauna, although it obviously has relatives on Africa in particular, and not so much the Asian land masses, because they really were not in contact. And so that, taken from the web and Asian land masses, means that if they are similar, those dinosaurs had to migrate around into Africa and then onto Madagascar, India, when they were connected with Africa. But after 120 million years, they had their own story. They were an ark floating away with dinosaurs, which really didn't have contact again with other land masses till the total extinction at 65 million years. Indian fossil record of dinosaurs is very good throughout the entire period from 250 million years ago to the extinction of 66 million years ago. You've got quite a good record of dinosaurs. And of course, I say all but the avian dinosaurs became extinct 65, 66 million years ago at the time of the Deccan Trap eruptions. Now, Madagascar also preserves some unique dinosaurs, and it was separated from India 85 million years ago, so it was floating as an ark as far as dinosaurs were concerned from 5 million years ago. And so it's got distinct dinosaurs which developed uniquely on Madagascar, but I don't think there's a very complete record at all of Madagascan dinosaurs. So you wouldn't have new migrated dinosaurs after that 120 million year separation from Africa. If we look at the period when Madagascar and India separated, in the 80 million years is the green oceanic crust. The 60 million year old is brown, then orange at 30, yellow at 10, etc. And the present day formation of oceanic crust is in pink along the red line. So there has been the separation of the Indian Ocean, which caused the very rapid movement of India to 15, 16 centimetres a year. India was moving, and that's 160 kilometres in a million years. That's pretty fast going, and probably the fastest ever recorded and accurately studied was India moving northward and closing those oceans, the Tethyan Oceans, to the north as the new Indian Ocean developed. So somewhere between the brown and the orange is 45 million years, which is the point where the red line, the boundary between the Somali plate and the Indian plate, crossed over the hotspot of reunion, and the ocean has grown since and has therefore separated the two trends, the extinct trends running northward through the Maldives to India, from the younger suite, less than 45 million years, when it crossed the boundary, which extend down through Mauritius to Reunion in the south. That's not very obvious. Just to the right of the two green things in the center of the diagram, marked as 80 million years, you can see a sort of vague maroon belt ending in a blue spot. East of Madagascar, the blue spot is Reunion, and the trail it has behind leading to the north are the extinct volcanoes that are post 45 million years. To read that, spreading of the oceans has separated the continents. Not only that, it has separated the trend of extinct volcanoes, which run northward, of course, the Maldives, somewhere near where we're at an Indian plate at 3 o'clock. You can see that trend running up to the west side through the 60 million year mark. The Somali plate here is outlined in red. It's probably one of the better examples. How mixed it is in geology when you look in detail, with older blue ocean at up to 180 million years, all the very old rocks of Africa and Madagascar, some of them 2 billion years or more, a whole complexity of different rock types crushed together. The age of rocks and oceanic crust of the West Indian Ocean is shown here in different colours, the youngest ones being pink and yellow, through browns to greens to blue, and older ones being tealy coloured or, in fact, pink and maroon. So you can see how it is that Madagascar had separated from Africa by 120 million years. Some of the oceanic crust is up to 180 million years. India and Madagascar didn't drift apart until 80 million years, and that's the green colour, the earliest ocean between them. So if you close up all the browns to yellows, put the two greens together, that's how things looked about 60 million years ago or 70 million years ago. And the symmetry of the ocean floor ages across the mid-ocean rift illustrates the spreading or growth of the Somalia and Indian plates with new oceanic crust over this interval of 80 million years. Now, looking at the mammals of Madagascar, how did they get there? Well, most of the mammal evolution, or almost all of it, has occurred since the separation of Madagascar and India from Africa. So how the hell did they get there? It wasn't just an arc. These had to migrate there. So you can imagine perhaps enormous floods coming down the Great Green Greasy Limpopo River, or out of Zaire and elsewhere, masses of vegetation on which were various primitive mammals, probably some dinosaurs, etc., if you're dealing with about 80 million years ago. And the earliest of the primates must have come in this way on floating bodies of vegetation at flood times out into the ocean and sailed across the Mozambique Strait, landing washed up by pure chance on the beaches of Madagascar. This would account for the early primates, which are, of course, the lemurs, and they possibly occurred separately, the two groups, 50 to 60 million years ago. This was post the big extinction event, and there are now 15 genera of extant non-human primates. It's the only place where the lemurs are preserved, and there were larger ones than any alive now, some as big as gorillas. These are believed to have become extinct only after the arrival of humans a couple of thousand years ago. Only 1,000 years ago, I think. About 100 extant species or subspecies of lemur occur. There are even over 100, I believe. But rodents represent 40% of the population. They too must have arrived on rafts of vegetation. There are moles and shrews, a lesser hedgehog, and the extinct hippo and a giant bird probably had different origins. Certainly the hippo seems to have swum across in several events, judging from its evolution history, several times in the last 60 million years. Giant bird also became extinct after man established himself on the island from Indonesia. Various carnivorous forms are related to the African mongoose. There's a huge number of species of those because they weren't hunted themselves. Many of the forms have a parallel evolution, apparently, to those that developed in Africa and elsewhere. And many have rafted from South Africa in the last 25 million years. So it's quite an interesting location for animal evolution. It's been a rather long session, so perhaps I won't go on in great detail here. I'll simply say the eastern part of the island is complex and very old, and it doesn't have direct comparison to the regions westerly of it in Zimbabwe, etc. It is much more similar to areas near the Horn of Africa, and one can go into some detail in discussion of its origin and how it moved south like that blue arrow. A cross-section of Madagascar from west to east looks very complicated in that you've got a thrusting of the older rocks eastward. I won't go into detail on this either, but there's quite a story related to it in both in the central regions and the southern regions of Madagascar. It differs. A lot of that occurred in the mountain building phase of 600 million years ago, the so-called Pan-African mountain building phase. So those are the old rocks. But in the west, these are overlain by a sequence of younger basin sediments, pretty similar to the way the Perth Basin sediments lap on to the Australian continent westerly of the Darling Scarp. Again, the Darling Scarp has got a complicated structure which all occurred much earlier than the basin sequence of the Perth Basin. I'll move on to the point where you've got a heat build-up under Madagascar today. Perhaps there is a different hotspot under the continent. There's been a long history of hotspot activity in this particular region where Madagascar lies today. We can only say that this is continuing with more recent volcanism, both in the centre of the island, where you've got the highest topography shown in grey there on that cross-section. This is a to A dashed cross-section from the south of the island to the north of the island. So clearly a hotspot in the north as well, where there's newer volcanism parallel to the situation of Mount Gambier and Mount Shank today. In fact, that's the topography. It caused quite a little bit of concern as to why you would have a field of volcanoes on Madagascar, but nowadays we appreciate that it's quite easy to have hotspots in various places, and this region is one of them. Looking now for questions. Thank you.